a woman vanished in 1986. 38 years later, a journal filled with chilling murder confessions would be found, and one of those entries seemed to describe her disappearance in terrifying detail. She waved goodbye to her friends. No one knew it was the last time anyone would ever see her alive. It was a warm night in the summer of 1986, the kind of night where the air clung to your skin and the streetlights glowed in a soft amber haze. The town was small, just a few thousand people tucked between rolling hills and winding highways. Everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. And in that kind of town, someone disappearing wasn't just strange, it was unthinkable. Her name was Laura McAllister. She was 22 years old, with a laugh that could carry across a room and the kind of restless energy that made her stand out even when she tried to blend in. That evening, she'd been with friends at a little diner on the edge of town. They'd lingered over coffee, jukebox tunes humming in the background, talking about the future dream jobs, road trips, half-serious plans to leave their small town behind. When Laura slid into her car and pulled out of the lot, it was close to midnight. She told her friends she was heading home, maybe to call her sister before bed. It was just a short drive, a straight shot down a two-lane road lined with old oak trees, a drive she had taken countless times before. But somewhere between that diner and her front door, Laura disappeared. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it all began. Laura's life was ordinary in the way that makes someone real, human, easy to picture. She worked part-time at a flower shop downtown, arranging bouquets with practiced hands. She was the type to sing along while she worked, off-key but fearless. Her coworkers teased her, but they loved her for it. On her days off, she liked to wander antique stores, running her fingers along dusty shelves and imagining the lives of the people who once owned those objects. She wrote little notes to herself in journals, snippets of poetry, reminders, sketches of flowers. Her family described her as thoughtful, but also stubborn. She had a streak of independence, a sense that she didn't want to be trapped by anyone else's expectations. She'd been talking more and more about moving to a bigger city, Chicago maybe, or St. Louis. She wanted more than what the town could give her. And that independence, that longing for more, would later become fuel for all the rumors that followed her disappearance. The night she vanished, the town was winding down. A few bars still had lights glowing, and the soft hum of cicadas filled the air. Somewhere, a dog barked. Neighbors recall that the street was unusually quiet, like the world itself was holding its breath. Laura's car, a pale blue Ford Escort, was seen turning down the road toward her neighborhood. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. The next morning, the first sign that something was wrong wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Her mother noticed her bed hadn't been slept in. At first, she assumed Laura had stayed at a friend's house, something she did from time to time, but when she called around, no one had seen her. Then the unease set in. Coffee sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Her purse and keys weren't at home. The car wasn't in the driveway. By noon, worry had turned into dread. Her father drove the roads between their house and the diner, eyes scanning ditches, pulling into parking lots, asking at gas stations if anyone had seen his daughter. Her mother called the police, but the response was cool, dismissive. "She's an adult," they said. Maybe she just needed some space. It was 1986. Missing adult women were too often dismissed as runaways or assumed to have gone off willingly. But her parents knew better. Laura wasn't the type to vanish without a word. She was close with her sister, called her almost every night. She had plans that weekend with friends. And most tellingly, her dog was still waiting at home. If Laura had left by choice, she wouldn't have left him behind. By evening, the town began to buzz. At the grocery store, whispers passed between aisles. At the post office, neighbors shook their heads. "Did you hear about Laura?" The kind of hushed conversation that carried both pity and fear, because in a town that size, someone's tragedy always felt like it might brush too close to your own life. And then came the discovery, the one detail that made Laura's disappearance more than just an absence: her car. 2 days after she vanished, a farmer found it parked at the edge of his field, just off a narrow dirt road. The doors were locked, the keys were gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass. Inside, her belongings sat neatly, a jacket folded on the back seat, a half-empty pack of gum in the console, and on the floorboard a cassette tape she'd been listening to. The car was clean, too clean. It felt less like someone had abandoned it, and more like someone had carefully placed it there. For investigators, that car was both a clue and a dead end. It was proof she hadn't simply run off. but it also offered nothing solid to follow. Tire tracks around it were smudged from the rain. No fingerprints turned up. Whoever had left it there had been careful. From that moment, Laura McAllister's disappearance became something bigger than a family worry. It became a mystery, a town-wide obsession, and for her family, a nightmare that would never really end. But what no one could have imagined, not her parents, not her friends, not the police, was that 38 years later, a tattered leather journal would surface. And inside its yellowed pages were words that seemed to come from a monster. Words that would change everything people thought they knew about what happened to Laura that night. Before a person becomes a headline, before their name turns into a mystery whispered in diners and repeated in police briefings, they're just themselves. To really understand the weight of Laura McAllister's disappearance, we have to step back from the car in the farmer's field and go inside her life, the life she had before the night she never came home. Laura grew up on the outskirts of town, in a modest one-story house with white siding that always seemed in need of a fresh coat of paint. Her father worked long hours as a mechanic at the local garage, his hands perpetually stained with grease. Her mother worked part-time at the library, the kind of job that let her bring home books by the stack. Between them, they created a household where hard work met curiosity. There was always a car engine on the driveway, and always the smell of paper and ink inside the house. Laura was the middle child, wedged between her older sister, Emily, and her younger brother, Jack. She had that restless middle child spirit, eager to carve her own place in the family, quick to push back when she felt overlooked. Friends later said that made her magnetic. She wasn't the most popular girl in school, but she was the one who could talk to anyone. Her high school teachers remembered her as bright but distracted. She had notebooks filled with doodles and poetry in the margins, like her mind was always 2 steps ahead of whatever was being taught. One teacher, Mrs. Greer, recalled a conversation where Laura stayed after class to ask about cities, what it was like to live somewhere where no one knew your name. She'd said it with a kind of longing, the same way some kids talk about the ocean when they've only ever seen lakes. And that was Laura's struggle in those years. She was both deeply tied to her small town and desperate to break free from it. She loved the comfort of home, but she dreamed of more. After graduation, Laura didn't leave right away. She took the flower shop job, telling herself it was temporary, just until she figured things out. But the shop became more than a paycheck. It gave her structure, a little creative outlet, and a front-row seat to the full spectrum of human emotion. She arranged flowers for funerals, birthdays, hospital rooms, and first dates. She saw joy, grief, hope, and loss all filtered through petals and stems. She once told a friend that the flower shop taught her more about people than school ever had. But if you asked her what she really wanted, she'd hesitate. Sometimes she said journalism, other times art. She even toyed with the idea of teaching. Her friends teased her about it. "Laura, you've got a new plan every week." But that was part of her charm. She believed her options were still wide open. Those who knew her best often pointed to her laugh. It wasn't delicate. It was big, contagious, the kind that drew eyes in a crowded room. She wasn't afraid to be silly, to dance to a jukebox in an empty diner booth, to start singing a song halfway through without remembering the words. She had a way of loosening people up, making them feel seen. At the same time, she had her shadows. Her sister Emily said Laura could fall into moods that no one could pull her out of, moments where she went quiet, withdrawn, lost in thought. She'd fill page after page of her journal during those stretches, writing in tiny slanted handwriting. No one knew exactly what she put in those notebooks, but Emily said she guarded them like treasure. Those journals would take on a haunting significance decades later, when another journal, one not written by her, surfaced, a cruel echo of Laura's private habit. Back in the mid-'80s, though, Laura's life was ordinary. She spent weekends with friends, usually at that little diner with the neon sign that flickered whenever it rained. She dated here and there, though nothing serious. Some described her as waiting for the right one. Others thought she was too restless to settle down in their small town. Whatever the truth, she seemed to have time on her side. One story that kept coming up when people talked about her after she vanished was about her dog, a golden retriever named Scout. She adored him. He was still just a puppy when she disappeared, but by then he was already the center of her world. She walked him every morning, rain or shine, often humming as she went. Neighbors recalled hearing Scout barking at the door in the days after she went missing, waiting for her to come back. That sound, more than anything, stayed with people. Laura also had a soft spot for music. She loved mixtapes, the kind made by recording songs off the radio, commercials and all. Her car was full of them, and she'd play them loudly with the windows down. The one found in her Ford Escort after she vanished was a mix her friend Mark had made for her songs they danced to at parties, songs that made them laugh. That tape, left behind, became almost symbolic. A frozen moment of the life she had, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. But Laura wasn't naive. She knew her town had darker sides. She knew the stories about the drifter who'd been arrested a few years back for assault, about the woman who'd gone missing in a neighboring county, about the whispers of drug trafficking along the highway. She wasn't blind to danger. In fact, friends said she sometimes carried her keys between her fingers when she walked to her car at night, a little makeshift weapon, just in case. That makes what happened to her even more chilling. When people looked back after her disappearance, they searched for signs, something, anything, that could explain how she ended up as the town's enduring mystery. Did she know someone she shouldn't have? Did she take a ride from the wrong person? Or was it something far more calculated, something that had been waiting for her? Her family clung to the good memories, the way she'd surprise her mom with coffee from the diner before work, the way she'd make her brother laugh so hard milk would come out of his nose, the way she'd stay up late talking with her sister about dreams they both knew might never happen. For years after she was gone, her mother kept her room almost exactly as it had been that summer. The floral bedspread, the stack of cassette tapes by the stereo, the journals lined up on the shelf. Dust gathered, but nothing was moved. It was like a shrine, a refusal to let time erase her. What people forget, when they hear about a disappearance decades later, is that the person at the center wasn't just a victim. They had a whole life, a messy, funny, ordinary, complicated life. And Laura's life mattered. That's what makes the discovery of that journal 38 years later so devastating, because inside those pages, the author didn't just confess to crimes, he stole voices. He described people in cold, detached detail, and in one of those entries, the words seemed to point directly at Laura. But that comes later. For now, all we have is the memory of who she was before the darkness swallowed her. The last evening of Laura McAllister's life as anyone knew it was deceptively ordinary. Ordinary, in fact, in a way that would haunt everyone who loved her. Because there were no obvious warnings, no arguments, no tearful goodbyes. Just a young woman, 22 years old, laughing with friends in a small-town diner, and then driving off into the night. That Friday had been hot, the kind of sticky Midwestern heat that lingered long after the sun dipped below the horizon. In town, ceiling fans hummed lazily in open windows. At the ball field, the final innings dragged on under floodlights that attracted moths by the hundreds. Down at the diner, though, the heat didn't matter. Inside, the jukebox played one of Laura's favorite songs, and her small circle of friends squeezed into their usual booth, their elbows knocking into each other as milkshakes and fries were passed around. Laura was in good spirits. She was wearing a simple sundress, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, strands falling loose around her face. She'd been talking about the antique shop where she'd gone earlier that afternoon, describing an old mirror she had seen. She joked that it probably belonged in a haunted house, but there'd been something about it she liked. Her friends teased her for her weird taste, but that was Laura. She saw beauty in things other people overlooked. They talked for hours, as young people do when time feels endless. College plans, music, the newest movie playing 2 towns over. Life stretched ahead like a long road with no dead ends. When the clock crept close to midnight, Laura stood, gathering her things. She teased her friends for staying too long. "We're going to close the place down," and promised to call the next day. She hugged one of them, waved to the others, and walked out into the night air. It was quiet outside. The lot was dim, lit only by a couple of flickering street lamps. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle cut through the silence. Laura slid into her pale blue Ford Escort, rolled the windows down, and let the warm air drift in. She turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life. Her friends watched her drive off. None of them thought it would be the last time they saw her. The drive home should have taken no more than 15 minutes. A straight shot down Main Street, then out past the Oaks and toward the little neighborhood where she lived with her parents and brother. She'd done it countless times before, but she never arrived. The first sign of something wrong came the next morning. Her mother, Caroline, noticed Laura's bed was untouched, neatly made, as it had been when she left the night before. The pillow hadn't been dented. The blanket hadn't been pulled back. At first, Caroline thought maybe Laura had stayed with her friend Emily, as she sometimes did after late nights. She called, but there was no answer. She called another friend, then another. Each time, the response was the same. "No, I haven't seen her." That sinking feeling grew heavier with every unanswered call. By mid-morning, Caroline was pacing the kitchen. A mug of coffee sat on the counter, untouched. She dialed the flower shop where Laura worked, just to check if maybe she had gone in early. The owner told her she hadn't shown up. By noon, her father, Richard, was behind the wheel of his pickup truck, retracing the route between their house and the diner. He drove slowly, his eyes sweeping the ditches, the side roads, every driveway. He stopped at gas stations, asking if anyone had seen his daughter. He even went into the diner, though he knew she hadn't gone back there. The waitress shook her head and said she had left around midnight, smiling, nothing unusual. Meanwhile, Caroline called the police. The response she got left her cold. "She's an adult," the dispatcher told her. "Maybe she just needed space. Happens all the time." Caroline tried to explain that Laura wasn't the type to vanish without a word. She was close to her family. She had her dog at home. She had work. She had plans. But the voice on the other end of the line was firm. "Give it a day or two. If she doesn't turn up, call us back." It was the 1980s, and missing young women were too often written off as runaways. Police resources were limited, and unless there was blood, a wrecked car, or something screaming foul play, families were often left to stew in fear. That night, Caroline and Richard barely slept. They sat by the phone, waiting for a call that never came. They walked through her room, looking for clues, though they didn't know what they were looking for. Everything was just as it had been, her journals stacked neatly, her clothes in the closet, Scout asleep at the foot of her bed, restless without her. By the following day, word had spread. In small towns, news travels faster than radio waves. At the grocery store, people whispered in the produce aisle. At church that Sunday, Laura's absence hung heavy in the silence between hymns. People shook their heads, muttering, "Something's not right." And then came the discovery. 2 days after she vanished, a farmer named Harold Jenkins noticed something odd while checking the far edge of his field. Parked near the tree line, half hidden from view, was a car. At first, he thought it might belong to hunters or teenagers sneaking off. But when he got closer, he saw the pale blue Ford Escort, its windows rolled up tight, its doors locked. It was Laura's car. The sheriff's office came out. Deputies walked slow circles around the vehicle, squinting in the sunlight. The car was spotless, almost eerily so. No mud smeared the tires, though the dirt road leading to it was damp from recent rain. No broken glass, no blood, no purse or wallet. On the back seat was a neatly folded jacket. On the floorboard, a cassette tape with handwriting on the label, Laura's Mix, July '86. It looked less like someone had abandoned their car, and more like someone had placed it there with careful intent. The sheriff's department towed it in for inspection. They dusted for fingerprints but came up empty. They checked the surrounding woods with dogs, but found no trace. The rain had washed away any tracks. Back at home, Caroline and Richard clung to hope that Laura might still walk through the door. But deep down, both admitted later, that hope had begun to waver when they saw the car. Something about it, the way it was too perfect, too arranged, felt wrong. That night, neighbors brought casseroles and pies, the way small towns do when tragedy hovers in the air. People sat in the McAllister kitchen, sipping coffee, shaking their heads, repeating the same phrase over and over. "She's such a sweet girl. I just don't understand." Neither did anyone else. And yet, as days turned into weeks, the official response remained frustratingly thin. Police logged her as a missing adult. They interviewed her friends, her co-workers, her ex-boyfriend. No one had seen or heard from her since that night at the diner. Without witnesses, without evidence, the case stalled before it even began. The McAllister family refused to let the silence take over. They printed flyers with Laura's picture, her brown hair falling loose over her shoulders, her eyes crinkled mid-laugh. They posted them on telephone poles, grocery store bulletin boards, and the windows of gas stations. They drove miles into neighboring counties, plastering her face anywhere someone might look. Each flyer read the same words: "Missing. Have you seen Laura McAllister?" The search had begun. But what no one knew then, what no one could have imagined, was that Laura's case would not be solved in days or weeks. It wouldn't be solved in years. It would take nearly 4 decades and the unearthing of a journal filled with unspeakable confessions before the truth began to claw its way out of the shadows. In those first few days, hope still had a fragile hold on the McAllister family. Maybe Laura had gotten lost. Maybe her car had broken down and she had walked to find help. Maybe she had taken off on a whim, though that theory never felt right. The human mind clings to the most ordinary explanations first, because the alternative, the darker, unspoken possibilities, are too heavy to face right away. But by the end of the first week, hope was being outpaced by fear. The search began informally, as many small-town searches do. Friends and family gathered in the McAllisters' driveway, car doors slamming shut, voices low but determined. They carried flashlights, baseball caps pulled down low, and wore boots ready for mud. A neighbor brought coffee in a thermos. Another showed up with a map of the surrounding backroads. They fanned out in groups, scouring fields, abandoned barns, riverbanks. Richard McAllister led one group down the dirt road where Laura's car had been found. He moved with a kind of desperate energy, his flashlight beam jerking across the ground, scanning for anything, a scrap of fabric, a footprint, anything at all. His son Jack, only 17 at the time, followed silently a few steps behind, his face pale in the moonlight. Caroline stayed at the house, manning the phone. Every ring sent her heart lurching. Most calls were from friends, offering support, or strangers reporting vague sightings that never panned out. Once, a woman swore she'd seen Laura in the next county, walking into a convenience store. Deputies followed up, but it turned out to be someone else entirely. Another caller claimed Laura had run off to Chicago, but couldn't say how they knew. Each false lead left Caroline weaker, but she kept answering the phone. What if the next call was the one? As the days stretched on, the local sheriff's department finally widened their efforts. Deputies drove patrol cars slowly down rural roads, their radios crackling with updates. Search dogs were brought in, noses pressed to the ground near where Laura's escort had been discovered. For a moment, everyone held their breath as the dogs pulled toward the woods. But after several hours, they came up empty. Whatever trail might have been there had been erased by rain and time. Flyers were taped to windows in every business in town: the post office, the grocery store, the bait shop. Her face stared back at people from every corner, that frozen smile making the absence behind it all the more unbearable. Reporters began to trickle in, first from nearby towns, then from larger outlets. A young woman, missing in the prime of her life, that was a story people would tune in for. Camera crews stood outside the McAllister home, their lights glaring in the dusk, capturing Caroline's tired eyes and Richard's trembling hands as they pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. The pressure on law enforcement grew. Reporters asked pointed questions at press conferences. Was this being investigated as a crime? Were there suspects? Did they believe Laura was still alive? The sheriff gave careful, vague answers. He said they were pursuing all leads. He said nothing was ruled out, but behind closed doors, some deputies admitted they were stumped. Rumors began to fill the vacuum left by the lack of answers. Some said Laura had been planning to leave town, that she'd finally acted on her talk of moving away. Others whispered about a secret boyfriend, someone older, someone dangerous. A few even suggested she might have gotten involved with drugs, a rumor that cut her mother deeply, though it spread like wildfire. For every person handing out flyers or joining the search, there was another spinning theories at the bar, or in the pews of the church, or at the counter of the diner where Laura had last been seen. The whispers grew louder than the facts. Still, the search pressed on. One evening, a large group gathered near the river that snaked just outside of town. The water was dark and slow, the banks overgrown with reeds. Flashlights bounced across the surface as men waded in up to their knees, dragging poles through the muck, praying not to find what they feared. Others combed the nearby woods, calling Laura's name until their voices cracked. At one point, Richard thought he saw something near the water's edge, a glint of fabric half buried in mud. His heart leapt, and he sprinted forward, only to find it was a torn piece of tarp, long discarded. He sank to his knees, shoulders shaking, as neighbors stood back in silence. That moment crystallized the pain of those searches, the whiplash of hope and despair, over and over again. The local church opened its doors each evening for prayer vigils. Candles flickered as people filled the pews, their faces bathed in soft light. Hymns were sung, tears fell, and prayers were spoken aloud, pleas for protection, for strength, for answers. Scout, Laura's dog, even lay at the foot of the altar one night, his head resting on his paws, as if waiting for her to return. And yet, no answers came. Weeks passed, and the initial fire of the search began to dim. People had jobs to go back to, families to care for, bills to pay. Search parties became smaller, less frequent. The sheriff's office scaled back their involvement, citing lack of new leads. The flyers faded in the sun, edges curling, colors bleeding from rain. But for the McAllister family, the search never ended. Richard still drove the back roads at night, headlights sweeping across empty fields. Caroline still sat by the phone, her hands trembling each time it rang. Emily, Laura's older sister, started keeping her own journal of the search dates, times, every rumor she heard, every place they checked. She said later that she was terrified Laura's story would be forgotten if she didn't write it down. And though the community's energy waned, the unease never left. There was a sense that something terrible had brushed past them, something they couldn't quite name. Parents began telling their daughters to be careful, not to drive alone at night. Locks were double-checked, curtains drawn tighter. A shadow had settled over the town, and it would not leave for a very long time. The first search ended without answers. But it was only the beginning of a mystery that would stretch on for decades, until a cracked leather journal pulled from an attic trunk would reveal words. No one could stomach words that would connect back to that humid summer night when Laura McAllister never came home. When the first search parties dwindled and the sheriff's department admitted they had little to go on, the vacuum was quickly filled with something else: theories. In small towns, silence doesn't last long. People will fill the gaps with their own stories, piecing together fragments, half-truths, and wild imagination until rumor hardens into conviction. And Laura McAllister's disappearance was fertile ground for rumor. Some of the theories were innocent enough, rooted in the belief that maybe, just maybe, Laura was still alive somewhere. These were the ones her mother clung to most in those early months. Perhaps Laura had grown tired of the town, of its smallness, its limits, its gossip. Maybe she'd left that diner, driven her escort past her turn for home, and just kept going toward Chicago, toward Street Louis, toward anywhere that wasn't here. Caroline replayed that theory in her head over and over. She imagined Laura stepping off a bus into a bustling city, wide-eyed but free, starting a life her family knew nothing about. It was a thin hope, but it was hope all the same. Others, though, weren't so kind. The first whispers of a secret relationship surfaced within weeks. People at the diner swore they'd seen Laura talking to a man none of them recognized a few nights before she vanished. He was described in vague, shifting terms, sometimes tall, sometimes stocky, sometimes with dark hair, sometimes blonde. The description changed depending on who told it. But the core rumor remained. Laura had been seeing someone in secret, and that someone might be responsible. Then, there were the darker stories. Some claimed Laura had been caught up in something she couldn't escape: drugs, trafficking, something hidden beneath the surface of their quiet town. One man insisted he'd seen her at a truck stop along the interstate weeks after she disappeared, getting into a long-haul truck. He told the story in bars, embellishing with each retelling, until people began repeating it as fact. Still others leaned into superstition. The county had its share of strange legends: abandoned barns rumored to be used for cult rituals, stretches of road people said were haunted. When a young woman vanishes without a trace, those stories bubble to the surface. At one point, a local preacher even suggested at a sermon that dark forces were at work, though he quickly backtracked when Caroline showed up at his door in tears, begging him not to spread that kind of talk. And then there were the psychics. It was the 80s, and television shows often showcased mediums claiming to solve cold cases. So it wasn't long before strangers began calling the McAllister house, offering visions and premonitions. One woman claimed she saw Laura near water, trapped and afraid. Another sent a letter describing a cabin in the woods with red curtains. The sheriff's office checked a few of these tips, but they never led anywhere. For the family, each one was a cruel roller coaster, brief hope followed by crushing disappointment. Through it all, Caroline tried to hold on to dignity. She politely listened when neighbors came to her with their theories, but inside, she was unraveling. Every rumor made her feel as though Laura was being rewritten, turned into someone she didn't recognize. She wasn't reckless, she told reporters. She wasn't involved in anything bad. She was just my daughter. She just wanted to live her life. But in town, the lines between truth and speculation blurred. People began to look at each other differently. Suspicion seeped into conversations. Who had really been at the diner that night? Who had driven down that dirt road before the car was found? Why did one neighbor remember seeing headlights near the field when no one else did? Every detail, no matter how small, became a potential clue or accusation. At the bar on Main Street, men leaned over their beers and swapped theories like trading cards. At the beauty salon, women whispered while curlers spun in their hair dryers. Even kids passing notes in school added to the legend, claiming their older brothers knew someone who saw Laura the night she vanished. The sheriff's department, for their part, grew increasingly frustrated. Without real evidence, their work was constantly derailed by wild tips. Deputies chased down leads that turned to dust, an abandoned car that wasn't hers, a stranger passing through town who had nothing to do with her, a supposed confession from a drunk man in another county that proved false. Each dead end wore them thinner. For Richard, the rumors cut deepest of all. He was a man who believed in hard facts, in fixing things with his hands. But there was nothing to fix here, only whispers he couldn't silence. One night, after overhearing two men at the gas station speculating that Laura had run off with some married guy, Richard slammed his fist on the counter so hard the clerk jumped. "That's my daughter you're talking about," he growled before storming out. And yet the whispers continued. In a town of only a few thousand, gossip travels faster than truth. Theories multiplied until no one could tell where they had started. Some people said Laura's disappearance reminded them of other missing women in nearby counties' cases that had never been solved. Others insisted it had to be someone local, someone hiding in plain sight. The most haunting theory of all, though, was the simplest, that Laura had left the diner, driven down that familiar road, and someone she trusted enough to stop for, was waiting. That possibility lingered in the back of everyone's mind, unspoken but heavy, because if it was true, it meant the danger wasn't out there, far away. It meant it was right there among them. As the months dragged on and the trail went cold, the rumors became the only thing keeping Laura's name alive in everyday conversation. But for her family, those theories were salt in a wound that never closed. They wanted facts, they wanted answers. What they got instead was a fog of suspicion, one that grew thicker with each passing year. And behind that fog, the truth, the real truth, waited, patient and terrible, inside the pages of a leather-bound journal that no one would discover for nearly 4 decades. Time has a way of dulling the edges of tragedy for most people. The town moves on, new stories replace the old ones. Children grow up, businesses open and close. What once dominated every conversation slowly becomes a shadow, mentioned only when something stirs the memory. But for the McAllisters, time did not dull anything. If anything, it sharpened the loss. After the initial frenzy of searches, flyers, vigils, and media attention, the case of Laura McAllister slipped into that limbo so many missing person cases fall into. With no new leads, no new sightings, no breakthroughs, the file was pushed to the back of the sheriff's cabinet. Deputies rotated in and out of the department. Some barely knew the details, only that there was that girl who went missing back in '86. The urgency drained away. But inside the McAllister home, urgency never left. Caroline kept Laura's room exactly the way it had been. The floral bedspread, the cassettes stacked by the stereo, the journals lined neatly on the shelf. She vacuumed around them, dusted carefully, as though Laura might walk in at any moment. Every birthday, Caroline baked a cake, lit a candle, and placed it on the kitchen table. Every Christmas, a stocking with Laura's name hung on the mantel. Those rituals became a way of refusing to let go, even as years piled onto years. Richard coped differently. He threw himself into work at the garage, his hands perpetually stained with grease, his back aching from long hours. But at night, he drove. Always driving, always scanning the fields, the rivers, the old barns. He filled notebooks with notes, roads he'd checked, abandoned houses he'd entered, places where someone said they'd heard something, seen something. Most entries ended with the same word, nothing. Emily, the older sister, went to college but came home often. She felt guilty for leaving, guilty for living a life that Laura never got to. In her dorm room, she tacked Laura's missing flyer to the wall. She told her roommates about her sister, not wanting her story to disappear, even hundreds of miles away. Later, when she married and had children of her own, she told them about their aunt they'd never meet. She described Laura's laugh, her stubbornness, her love for Scout the dog. She made sure her children knew Laura was more than just a missing person poster. Jack, the youngest, carried the disappearance like a shadow over his teenage years. He was only 17 when she vanished, and he grew into adulthood under the weight of that absence. Friends remembered him as quiet, guarded, quick to anger when Laura's name came up in conversation. He dropped out of community college, drifted between jobs, and always seemed restless. "It's like a part of him froze in '86, one friend later said. For the town, though, Laura's absence became part of the landscape. People still mentioned her name from time to time, usually in hushed tones. "Remember Laura McAllister?" they'd say, when another woman's case appeared on the news. Or, "It's been years now, hasn't it?" She became a kind of local ghost story, a warning parents used to remind their daughters not to drive alone at night. Every few years, the case would flicker back into the spotlight. A new sheriff would reopen the file, shuffle through the yellowed reports, send a deputy to interview old witnesses. Sometimes a tip would surface a woman who looked like Laura in another state, a man who claimed to know what happened, but every time, the trail went cold. The sheriff's department didn't have the resources for deep investigations, and bigger agencies weren't interested in an old missing person case without clear evidence of foul play. As the 90s rolled on, the McAllisters watched as other cases made headlines. Names of missing women flashed across televisions, captured national attention, while Laura's case remained in the shadows. Caroline wrote letters to news programs, begging them to cover her daughter's story. Most went unanswered. The few that did respond said there wasn't enough new information to warrant coverage. By the 2000s, technology was changing investigations everywhere. DNA testing, databases, digital communication, all tools that hadn't existed in '86. For a moment, hope surged again. Caroline petitioned for Laura's belongings to be tested, for the car to be re-examined with modern methods. But by then, much of the evidence had degraded. Some items had even been lost in storage. The promise of science couldn't fix what had been neglected for so long. And so the years kept passing. Scout, Laura's beloved golden retriever, grew old and passed away. Caroline wept for days, saying it felt like losing a final living link to her daughter. Emily's children grew taller, asking questions about the aunt they'd never know. Richard's health began to falter, his body breaking down from years of overwork and stress. Still, he drove those back roads whenever he could. Every anniversary of Laura's disappearance brought a new wave of grief. Some years the family held vigils. Other years they sat together quietly at home, unable to bear the weight of public attention. Reporters stopped coming after the 10th anniversary. By the 20th, only local papers ran short blurbs, often buried in the back pages. But inside the McAllister house, time didn't move in neat decades. It was always the summer of '86, always the night she didn't come home, always the sound of the phone not ringing, the car not pulling into the driveway. Emily once said it felt like living inside a wound that never healed. "We were expected to move on, but how do you move on when there's no ending? We were trapped in that night forever." And that was the cruelest part of the cold years, not just the lack of answers, but the erosion of hope. The longer Laura was gone, the harder it became to believe she was still alive. Yet the alternative that she was gone, and they would never know how, was unbearable too. For nearly 4 decades, the McAllisters lived in that in-between. Grief without closure, mourning without a body, questions without answers. And all the while the truth sat quietly in an attic trunk in another part of town, bound in cracked leather and inked in a hand that should have been exposed years earlier. A journal filled with secrets, waiting to be found. By the time nearly 4 decades had passed since Laura McAllister vanished, her name had become more memory than presence in the town. People still remembered, of course they always would, but it had faded into the background noise of small-town history, like the fire that once burned down the mill, or the flood that washed out the bridge. Another story folded into the past. And then, in the summer of 2024, a man named Henry Klein died. Henry wasn't the type of man most people noticed. He had lived in town nearly his entire life, but he wasn't particularly close with anyone. He'd worked odd jobs, some construction, some farmhand work, later as a janitor at the high school. He was the kind of man you saw but didn't think about, standing in line at the grocery store, hunched over in a booth at the diner, mowing his lawn with slow, methodical strokes. People described him as quiet, reserved, maybe a little strange. He never married, never had children. He lived alone in a weathered two-story house on the edge of town, its paint peeling, its shutters sagging. Neighbors said he kept odd hours, sometimes awake late into the night, a single light glowing in the upstairs window. But no one ever had reason to suspect him of anything worse than being eccentric. When Henry passed away suddenly, from a heart attack at 75, there wasn't much ceremony. No children to mourn him, no wife to make arrangements. His only surviving relative was a distant cousin who lived several states away. That cousin hired an estate company to clean out the house and prepare it for sale. And it was during that clean-out that the discovery was made. The house was cluttered but not chaotic. Stacks of old newspapers, boxes of clothes, tools piled in the garage. The crew worked their way through each room, sorting what could be donated from what would be thrown away. In the attic, beneath a pile of blankets and holiday decorations, they found an old trunk. Heavy, metal corners rusted, the kind that seemed to belong to another era. Inside, among faded photographs and bundles of letters tied with string, there was a book, a leather-bound journal, cracked with age, its pages yellowed, its cover worn soft from handling. At first glance, it looked like the kind of thing someone might use to jot down thoughts, maybe sketches or grocery lists. But when one of the workers flipped it open, his breath caught. The handwriting inside was small, cramped, deliberate, and the words, at least in the first few entries, were unsettling. Not diary musings, but confessions. Descriptions of things done, things that should never have been put to paper. At first, the workers thought it might be some kind of morbid fiction. But as they skimmed further, the entries grew darker, more detailed, too precise to be fantasy. They called the sheriff's office. Deputies arrived, took the trunk and its contents into evidence, and began to read. What they found inside would shake the town to its core. Because among those pages filled with chilling recollections of violence and cruelty, was an entry that described, in uncanny detail, the disappearance of a young woman in the summer of 1986. A woman last seen leaving a diner, a woman whose car had later been found abandoned by a field. It was Laura McAllister. The words were blunt, stripped of emotion. Henry had written about being there, about seeing her leave the diner, about how he had followed her. He described her car, her jacket, even the cassette tape she'd been listening to. Things never made public. Things only the person responsible could have known. The journal had been sitting in his attic for decades. For investigators, it was like opening a window into the past. Suddenly, the coldest of cold cases had a fresh spark. They had a suspect, though he was already dead. They had what appeared to be a confession, though written in a way that blurred the line between admission and story. The journal was not just about Laura. There were other entries too, other names, other descriptions. It seemed to suggest Laura had not been Henry's only victim. When the news broke, the town reeled. The quiet man they had passed on sidewalks, the man who swept high school hallways, the man who had lived among them for decades, he had been harboring secrets darker than anyone could have imagined. For the McAllister family, the discovery was a double-edged blade. After 38 years of torment, there was finally a name, finally an explanation. But there would be no trial, no confrontation, no chance to demand answers face to face. The man who had stolen Laura from them had slipped away, quietly, just as he always had in life. Still, the journal was there, the words were there, and for the first time in decades, the case was alive again. The sheriff's office assembled a task force, determined to verify the journal's claims. Was Henry Klein truly the man responsible? Were there other victims they didn't know about? And most importantly, what exactly had happened to Laura that night in 1986? The search for the truth had begun again. And this time, it wasn't fueled by rumor or speculation. It was fueled by the chilling words of a man who had hidden in plain sight, his secrets bound in leather, waiting for someone to finally open the book. The journal was unlike anything investigators had ever handled. It wasn't just a diary, it was a record, a ledger of sorts, written in tight, slanted script that filled page after page. The leather cover was cracked, the binding soft, the corners frayed. The pages inside had yellowed, edges curling slightly, the ink faded in places but still legible. Whoever had written it, Henry Klein, had done so with meticulous care, as though what he was recording mattered greatly to him, even if he never intended anyone else to see it. The first entries dated back to the late 1970s. They were written in short, staccato sentences, almost clinical. Descriptions of encounters, vague references to her or the girl. At first glance, the entries could almost be mistaken for fiction, dark stories jotted down in secret. But as investigators read further, the details became sharper. The places described matched real locations in the county. The descriptions of clothing, cars, even weather lined up with specific days. Then came the entry dated July 12, 1986. The words chilled investigators to the bone. She left the diner laughing. I followed. The road was quiet, just us and the trees. She didn't see me until I was already there. She trusted me enough to stop. That was her mistake. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, no hesitation. Her car is parked now. I locked it, left her jacket folded, her tape on the floor. It looks neat, clean. No one will know, not for a while. The deputies who read those lines felt the air leave the room. It was Laura. The details were exact. Her laugh, her jacket, the cassette tape. None of those things had ever been released publicly. The entry continued, but the words grew more vague, more abstract. She cried. They always do. But it was quiet out there, only the cicadas. She was gone before anyone could hear. The field kept its silence. The woods, too. No one will find her. I made sure of that. The pages offered no specific location, no coordinates, no map, just chilling assurance that he had hidden her well. That single entry would have been enough to reopen the case, but the journal didn't stop there. There were other names, some written in full, others only hinted at. Some entries described women who had gone missing in nearby counties, cases that had also gone cold. Investigators began cross-referencing, their hearts sinking as the similarities stacked up. The journal painted a portrait not of a one-time crime of opportunity, but of a predator who had stalked quietly for years. What made it worse was the tone. Henry's words weren't confessions in the way most people think of them. There was no remorse, no guilt. He wrote with detachment, as though he were documenting chores. The weather, the day of the week, what the victim wore, how long it took before she stopped struggling, cold, methodical, precise. At times, the entries strayed into strange territory. He referred to the quiet as though it were a companion. He wrote about the woods and fields as if they conspired with him, keeping his secrets. The trees understand. They do not tell. They hold what I give them. For investigators, these passages made the journal all the more sinister. It wasn't just confession, it was communion. He saw himself as part of something larger, something hidden and dark. As word spread within the department, detectives and deputies alike crowded into the evidence room, taking turns reading passages aloud in hushed voices. Some had to walk out, unable to stomach the matter-of-fact cruelty. Others felt anger rise in their throats, anger that Henry Klein had lived among them all those years, sweeping the hallways of their children's school, nodding at them in grocery store aisles, while carrying this private record of horror. The journal was turned over to state investigators, who began cataloging every page. Forensic teams handled it carefully, photographing, scanning, searching for fingerprints, hair, any biological evidence that might tie Henry more concretely to the crimes. The words alone were powerful, but in the eyes of the law, they needed more. Still, the implications were staggering. If the entries were true, then Laura's disappearance was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern. When the McAllister family was informed, the news landed like a bomb. Caroline sobbed, her body shaking so violently Emily had to hold her upright. Richard sat in silence, his face pale, staring at the wall. Emily later said he whispered only one word: bastard. Jack, now a grown man hardened by decades of grief, punched a wall so hard he fractured his hand. For them, the journal was both a gift and a curse. Finally, after nearly 40 years, there was an explanation. Proof that Laura had not simply run away, proof that her memory had been twisted by rumors unfairly. But it was also confirmation of their worst fears, that she had suffered, that she had been taken by someone who walked freely among them. The town, too, was shaken. People dug through their memories of Henry Klein, the janitor at the high school, the man at the diner counter, the neighbor who waved but never lingered. Everyone remembered him differently, quiet, odd, maybe unsettling, but no one had seen this. No one had imagined the journal hidden in his attic, page after page of cruelty written in his careful hand. The local paper called it the Journal of Confessions. But for investigators, it wasn't just a headline. It was a roadmap into horrors they had missed. And if they wanted to give Laura's family the answers they deserved, they had to follow it, page by page, line by line, even into the darkest corners. Because somewhere in those pages, beyond the vagueness and the abstractions, there had to be a clue, a location, a detail that would lead them to where Laura had been hidden all those years ago. The hunt was back on. The journal was more than just a confession, it was a puzzle. And for investigators in 2024, that puzzle became an obsession. The sheriff's office, which for years had filed Laura McAllister's case under cold, now found itself at the center of renewed attention. State investigators joined in, boxes of old evidence were hauled out of storage, and photographs yellowed with age were spread across tables once again. The first step was to validate the journal. Was it truly Henry Klein's writing? Forensic analysts compared the cramped script to old employment records, letters, and signatures. The match was undeniable. It was his hand, his ink, his words. Next came the cross-referencing. Investigators took each entry, each vague description, and held it against missing persons files from the late 70s through the 90s. The matches were chilling. A woman who vanished after leaving a bar in a nearby county. Another who disappeared while jogging along a rural road. The details weren't always exact, but the overlaps were too strong to ignore. But the entry that mattered most was Laura's. Her case had haunted the town for nearly 4 decades, and now the journal offered the first real glimpse into what had happened that summer night. Still, the words were infuriatingly vague. Henry described the road, the cicadas, the car. He described her crying, her silence. But he never said where she was taken, never wrote where she was laid to rest. Detectives pored over every sentence, hunting for hidden meaning. One line stood out. "The trees understand. They hold what I give them." It seemed poetic at first, but to investigators, it suggested a wooded area. And Henry had spent years working construction, farm work, odd jobs that gave him access to countless fields, barns, and forests. Narrowing it down felt impossible. They began re-interviewing anyone who had known Henry, former co-workers, old neighbors, teachers who had worked at the high school during his janitor years. The stories that surfaced painted a picture of a man who was forgettable in public, but unsettling in private. One woman recalled Henry offering her a ride home from the grocery store when her car broke down. She said she declined, but something in his eyes had made her uneasy. Another remembered how he sometimes lingered in the school hallways longer than he needed to, his mop bucket untouched as he watched students pass. Small things, harmless at the time, but in hindsight, they stacked up like bricks in a wall. Investigators also began digging through property records. They discovered that Henry had briefly rented a small hunting cabin in the late 80s, located deep in the woods not far from where Laura's car had been found. The cabin had long since fallen into disrepair, the roof collapsed, the walls sagging, but when search teams returned with cadaver dogs, the animals became agitated near the tree line. Excavation teams moved in, shovels cutting through soil that hadn't been disturbed in decades. At first, it seemed like another false lead, but then, just a few feet down, fragments began to surface. Cloth. Bone. The coroner's office confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. The remains belonged to a young woman in her early 20s, consistent with Laura's age when she vanished. DNA testing, even degraded after decades in the ground, matched with samples Caroline and Emily provided. It was Laura. The journal had led them to her at last. When the news reached the McAllister family, grief and relief collided in a way words couldn't capture. Caroline collapsed into Emily's arms, sobbing that she had always known Laura was gone, but had prayed she was wrong. Richard, too weak from years of illness to stand for long, wept openly, whispering, "I can bring her home now." Jack, hardened by years of anger, punched the air, screaming not in triumph but in rage that it had taken so long, that Henry had lived freely all those years. For the investigators, the discovery was both victory and burden. They had answered the McAllisters' questions, but the journal suggested there were more victims, women still hidden, families still waiting for answers of their own. Henry's secrets had not all been unearthed. And yet, Laura's story had reached a turning point. The girl who had left the diner laughing in 1986, who had been reduced to a flyer on a telephone pole, who had been swallowed by rumor and silence, she had been found. But the truth of how she was taken, and what happened in those final hours, still lay in the journal. And investigators, with shaking hands, turned the pages to uncover the full horror of Henry Klein's confessions. The journal had confirmed what the McAllisters had feared all along. Laura hadn't chosen to leave, hadn't slipped away into some new life. She had been taken. And she had been taken by someone who had lived right there among them, hidden behind an ordinary face. For the investigators, reading those words was like stepping back into that humid July night in 1986. The entry was short, almost brutally simple, but it contained everything they needed to know. She trusted me. She shouldn't have. The night was thick, the air heavy. I pulled off the road, and she followed. She thought I was helping. They always think that. It didn't take long. The woods swallowed her, and no one looked close enough. I left her neat, so they would wonder. The car was my gift to them, a puzzle they would never solve. The phrasing "gift to them" struck investigators hardest. Henry Klein hadn't just been trying to cover his tracks, he had been toying with them. For 38 years, the McAllisters had lived with a mystery he had crafted, a performance in plain sight. What made it worse was the knowledge that Laura likely hadn't fought him until it was too late. She had trusted him. That was the kind of person she was: open, kind, willing to believe the best in people. That small act of decency had become her undoing. The family was given the entry to read in private. Caroline sobbed as Emily held her, whispering, "I always knew she wouldn't have left us. I always knew." Richard, frail but resolute, insisted on reading the lines aloud, his voice breaking. "She thought he was helping," he said. "She thought he was helping." The betrayal of that simple trust cut deeper than any knife could. The funeral that followed was unlike any the town had seen in decades. Nearly the entire community turned out, some traveling from neighboring counties, some returning after years away. The church was filled to capacity, with people standing along the walls, spilling into the parking lot. It was as though everyone had come not only to mourn Laura, but to reckon with their own silence, their own complicity in letting the years drift by. The service began with music, an old hymn Laura had loved. Her voice once remembered singing it off-key in the church choir. Then Emily stood at the pulpit, clutching her notes with trembling hands. She didn't speak about Laura as a victim. She spoke about her as a sister, about her laugh, about her stubborn streak, about her dream of moving to a city where no one knew her name. She told the congregation that Laura's story wasn't just about how she died, it was about how she lived. Richard, though weakened, insisted on speaking too. He leaned on the lectern, gripping it as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. "For years," he said, "I drove those roads looking for her. Every night, I prayed I'd see her headlights coming home. I didn't, but I know now where she island. And I know she's at peace." His voice cracked, and the church went silent except for the sound of muffled sobs. Caroline couldn't speak. She sat in the front row, clutching Laura's photograph in her hands, rocking gently as if trying to soothe a child. Jack sat beside her, his hand resting over hers, his jaw clenched. When Laura was finally laid to rest, the entire town stood graveside. Flowers covered the casket. The air was heavy, not with the humid heat of July this time, but with the weight of nearly 4 decades of grief. But even as the McAllisters found some measure of closure, the journal continued to haunt investigators. Because Laura's entry wasn't the last. The final pages contained fragments, scattered notes written in a shakier hand. Some were incoherent ramblings about the quiet and the trees. But one line stood out, circled twice, written with unusual urgency. "There are more than you think. Not all of them are in the woods." The meaning of that line became the new obsession. Had Henry hidden other victims in places no one had searched? Did it mean some were buried elsewhere under foundations he helped pour as a construction worker, in abandoned wells, in places lost to time? Or had it been his way of taunting investigators even after death, ensuring the mystery would never fully die with him? Searches were launched. Teams scoured abandoned properties Henry had worked on, fields he had frequented, stretches of road he had mentioned vaguely in the journal. Cadaver dogs were deployed again, drones scanned forests from above, leads trickled in from families of other missing women who begged investigators to compare their cases to Henry's words. Some matched. Others didn't. The town that had once whispered about Laura in diners and bars now spoke openly about Henry Klein. Parents pointed to his photograph in the newspaper and told their children, "That's why you don't trust strangers." People who had once nodded to him in grocery stores now replayed every memory with a shiver. He fixed my roof. He swept my hallway. He was at my niece's graduation. The banality of his presence made the darkness behind him all the more unbearable. For the McAllisters, the aftermath was complicated. They had answers, yes. They had Laura's body back, yes. But they would never have justice. Henry was gone. He had slipped away quietly, his secrets nearly dying with him. There would be no trial, no confrontation, no chance to see him in handcuffs. He had denied them that. And so closure came with a bitter edge. Caroline described it best in an interview. We found her, but we'll never be able to ask him why. Why Laura? Why that night? Why any of them? Still, they had her back. They could bury her. They could speak of her life without the weight of uncertainty crushing every word. And yet, even as Laura was laid to rest, the final line of the journal refused to rest. Not all of them are in the woods. Investigators continue to debate its meaning. Some believe it points to more bodies, undiscovered victims scattered across the Midwest. Others think it was Henry's final act of control, leaving behind a riddle so the silence would never truly end. Whatever the case, one truth remains. Laura McAllister's story, after 38 years, was no longer a question mark. It was a tragedy, yes, but it was also a reminder of resilience. Her family had endured nearly 4 decades of limbo, and still they had loved her, remembered her, spoken her name. And when the truth finally came torn from the pages of a journal left to rot in an attic, they were there to face it, together. The town moved forward, but the shadows Henry Klein left behind linger still. People say that if you drive down that stretch of road on a quiet summer night, when the cicadas are humming and the air is heavy, you can almost see a pale blue car parked by the trees. You can almost hear laughter fading into the dark. And somewhere, perhaps in a place no one has thought to look, the rest of Henry's secrets are still waiting.